When we speak about the ancient world, we often imagine great monuments, towering pyramids, and mysterious temples filled with hieroglyphs. But the truth of daily life in ancient Egypt begins not with stone or gold, but with water. The Nile River, flowing calmly from south to north, was the true lifeline of Egypt. Without it, there would have been no civilization, no harvests, no settlements, and no stories to remember. To understand how the people of Egypt lived, we must start here at the river's edge where each day truly began. Every morning, as the sun rose over the eastern horizon, painting the desert sky with a soft glow, the villagers of Egypt awoke to the rhythm of the Nile. The river was not only a source of water but also a clock, a calendar, and a promise of life. The annual flood, called the inundation, arrived with such reliability that it was celebrated as a divine event. The waters swelled, carrying fertile silt from distant lands, and when the waters receded, they left behind dark, rich soil. This soil, unlike the barren sands of the desert beyond, made Egypt a land of green fields and thriving crops. The farmers, who made up the majority of Egypt's population, depended on this cycle. At dawn, they would lead their oxen to the fields. The air was cool, and the land smelled of damp earth. With wooden plows tied to animals, they scratched the soil, preparing it for seeds of barley and emmer wheat. The tools were simple, but they were reliable, passed down from father to son, generation after generation. As they worked, children might scatter seeds into the furrows, their laughter blending with the quiet calls of water birds flying over the river. Fishing was another daily rhythm tied to the Nile. Men with simple reed boats set out as the sun climbed higher, casting nets into the calm waters. Fish such as perch and catfish were staples of the Egyptian diet. Sometimes, fishermen used woven traps or even their bare hands in the shallows. The catch was brought back to the village, where women salted and dried fish to preserve it for days when fresh food was scarce. The Nile was generous, providing not just water, but also nourishment. For many villagers, mornings were also times of prayer. Before setting out to the fields, small offerings might be left to local household gods or to Hapi, the spirit of the Nile's flood. These were not grand temple rituals, but quiet personal moments. A piece of bread, a sip of beer, or a whispered word of gratitude. To the Egyptians, every part of nature held a sacred essence, and the river was the most sacred of all. The riverbank itself was alive with activity. Women walked down with clay jars balanced gracefully on their heads, filling them with water for cooking, washing, and drinking. Children splashed at the edges, their shouts carrying across the still morning air. Herds of goats and cattle were brought down to drink, their hooves stirring the mud at the shore. For the ancient Egyptians, this was not just a river, it was the center of life, the meeting place, and the provider. The houses that stood a little back from the river were modest, built from mud brick. Each day, the rising sun warmed the walls, and smoke from small cooking fires drifted into the air. Inside, families gathered for their first meal, often bread baked from the wheat harvested months earlier, and beer brewed from barley. It was a simple breakfast, sometimes flavored with dates or onions, but it was enough to give strength for the long hours of labor ahead. Midday was harsh. The Egyptian sun could be relentless, beating down upon the fields. Workers often paused to rest under whatever shade they could find, perhaps the sparse shadow of a palm tree. During this time, the Nile shimmered with blinding light, and the air was filled with the hum of insects. Life slowed, but it did not stop. Even in the heat, water carriers moved from field to field, ensuring that both workers and animals could continue their tasks. The relationship between the Egyptians and the Nile was not only practical, but also emotional. They spoke of the river in poetry, carved hymns into stone, and wove its name into their myths. To them, the Nile was a god, a friend, and sometimes even a parent. It gave life, but it could also bring hardship. If the flood was too low, the harvest would fail, and hunger would spread. If the flood was too high, villages could be damaged. Each year, families waited anxiously to see what kind of blessing or trial the river would bring. As the afternoon wore on, and shadows stretched long across the land, the farmers gathered their tools, and fishermen brought in their nets. Families reunited by the riverbank. Children helped carry baskets of vegetables, reeds, or fish back to the homes. The sound of livestock filled the air, donkeys braying, geese honking, cows lowing as they returned from grazing near the water. Evenings by the Nile were gentle. The heat softened, and the sky turned shades of orange and purple. Families shared their meals together. Bread, beer, fish, and sometimes lentils or figs filled their bowls. Neighbors might gather outside their homes, talking about the day's work, sharing news, or simply enjoying the cool air. The Nile glowed in the fading light, its surface reflecting the last rays of the sun. For the Egyptians, every day was a cycle that began and ended with the river. It was the first thing they saw in the morning and the last thing they heard at night, its quiet flowing a lullaby that reminded them of continuity and order. Pharaohs might have ruled with grandeur, and temples might have risen in splendor, but for the common people, life was defined by these simple, repeated acts. The fields, the river, the harvest, and the family gathered around a humble meal. The dawn of the Nile was not only the dawn of each day, but also the dawn of civilization itself. In the quiet routines of these villagers, in the steady plowing of fields and the casting of nets, the great story of ancient Egypt was written. Not in grand battles or royal decrees, but in the soft footsteps along the riverbank, the call of a fisherman, and the whisper of water against the reeds. And so, as the night settled over the land, the people of Egypt rested, knowing that tomorrow the Nile would rise again, and with it, life would continue. Homes and family life in ancient Egypt. When we imagine the lives of ancient Egyptians, it is easy to picture temples, pyramids, or golden tombs filled with treasures. But most Egyptians never entered a temple as priests or touched gold in their lifetimes. Their world was far simpler. For them, daily life was centered around the home, a modest mud-brick structure built close to the Nile where families lived, worked, and found comfort. To step into one of these homes is to step into the heart of Egyptian society, where everyday rhythms unfolded quietly, far from the eyes of kings. The houses of ordinary Egyptians were made from mud bricks, created by mixing the Nile's clay-rich soil with water and straw. Families shaped the bricks and left them to dry in the sun, a process that could take days. These homes were practical rather than grand. Most were 1 or 2 rooms, with flat roofs supported by wooden beams. The walls were thick, designed to keep out the heat of the desert sun, and the small windows let in only slivers of light. To us, they might seem dark and cramped, but to the Egyptians, they were safe and familiar spaces. Inside, the furniture was minimal. A few low stools or woven reed mats served as seating. There might be a wooden chest for storing clothes, pottery jars for holding grain and water, and perhaps a small altar for family offerings. Beds were simple frames made of wood, stretched with woven cords or reeds, sometimes covered with linen or animal hides. For most people, comfort was found not in luxury, but in routine. The home was not only a shelter, but also the center of family life. In ancient Egypt, the family was the foundation of society. Men, women, and children each had roles to play, and together they formed the structure that kept daily life steady. The father was usually the head of the household. His duties included working the fields, fishing, or practicing a trade such as carpentry or stone cutting. The mother's role was equally important. She managed the household, baked bread, brewed beer, raised children, and sometimes tended small gardens near the home. Children grew up surrounded by these routines. From an early age, boys helped their fathers in the fields, learning how to plow, sow, and harvest. Girls followed their mothers, learning the skills of cooking, weaving, and keeping the house in order. Childhood was short, and by the time they were teenagers, most children were already prepared for adult responsibilities. Still, children did have moments of joy. They played games with clay balls, toy animals carved from wood, or spinning tops. Sometimes they joined in board games like Senet, a favorite pastime across Egypt. The rhythm of family life was guided by food and work. Each day the mother would grind grain on a stone slab, kneeling over it and pushing the stone back and forth until flour was made. Bread was baked in clay ovens, while beer, the staple drink, was brewed in large jars. Beer was thick, nutritious, and safe to drink when water might not always be clean. Meals were simple but filling: bread, onions, fish, lentils, and dates. On special occasions, families might enjoy meat, though this was rare for common households. The courtyard of a home was an important space. It was often where cooking and household work took place, since the heat and smoke from fires were better kept outside. In the courtyard, animals such as goats, ducks, or chickens might be kept, providing eggs, milk, and meat. Sometimes small gardens were planted with herbs, vegetables, or fruit trees. These courtyards were also social places where neighbors could meet, share stories, and help one another. Family life also included faith. Most homes had a small shrine or altar where statues of protective household gods were kept. One of the most popular was Bes, a dwarf-like figure who was believed to guard mothers, children, and the home. Taweret, the goddess shaped like a hippopotamus, was another guardian, protecting women during childbirth. Families prayed to these deities for health, safety, and good fortune. Religion was not just a matter of temples and priests, it was woven into the very fabric of domestic life. Marriage in ancient Egypt was not a ceremony of pomp and grandeur for most people. It was a practical arrangement, often sealed simply when a man and woman agreed to live together as husband and wife. Yet this practicality did not mean there was no affection. Ancient writings suggest that love and companionship were deeply valued. Husbands and wives often worked side by side, supporting one another in both labor and family matters. Women had more rights than in many other ancient societies. They could own property, inherit wealth, and even initiate divorce. These freedoms made them respected partners within the household. The extended family was equally important. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins often lived nearby or even within the same home. The Egyptian household was not an isolated unit, but part of a broader web of kinship and community. Life was hard, and survival often depended on cooperation. Families supported each other during harvests, festivals, and times of difficulty. At night, the home became a place of rest. Families gathered for evening meals, often sharing bread and beer by the light of oil lamps. The children might fall asleep to the murmur of their parents' voices or to stories passed down from generation to generation. Outside, the desert air cooled, and the sound of the Nile drifting quietly in the distance reminded them that tomorrow's cycle of life would be the same. While grand temples and palaces survive in ruins, most of these family homes have vanished. Made of mud brick, they crumbled back into the earth long ago, leaving behind little trace of the ordinary lives that once filled them. Yet through ancient records, paintings on tomb walls, and archaeological finds, we can glimpse the reality that ancient Egypt was not only the land of kings and gods, but also a land of families, living simple, steady lives in the shadow of the Nile. The story of Egypt is not just about pharaohs or pyramids. It is about the daily routines inside these humble mud brick houses where bread was baked, children were raised, and prayers were whispered at small household shrines. It is about the bonds of family, the quiet strength of women, the hard labor of men, and the laughter of children playing in dusty courtyards. These homes, though simple, were the true foundation of Egypt's greatness. And so, when the people of ancient Egypt laid their heads down to sleep each night, they did so in these modest houses, held by the embrace of family, listening to the soft wind over the river. It was here, in the ordinary rhythms of domestic life, that the spirit of Egypt was born and nurtured. Food and feasting in ancient Egypt. When we think about the daily lives of the ancient Egyptians, we must remember that food was not only a necessity, but also a reflection of their world. It was shaped by the Nile, by the rhythms of farming, and by traditions passed down over generations. For ordinary families, meals were simple and repetitive, yet nourishing. For the wealthy, food could become a display of luxury, filled with flavors, variety, and abundance. To understand their world, one must first sit with them at their tables, whether humble or grand. The foundation of the Egyptian diet was bread. Made from emmer wheat or barley, bread was eaten at almost every meal. Women prepared the grain by grinding it on heavy stone slabs, a task that was both exhausting and time-consuming. Hour after hour, they pushed the grinding stone back and forth, creating flour fine enough to bake. The flour was then mixed with water, shaped into loaves, and baked in clay ovens or even on flat stones heated by fire. This bread was often coarse, filled with bits of sand or husk, since grinding was imperfect. Over time, this wore down the teeth of Egyptians, as we know from the remains of mummies, whose teeth were often badly worn even at a young age. Alongside bread, beer was the second great staple of the Egyptian diet. But beer, in their world, was not the golden, clear liquid we imagine today. It was thick, more like a porridge, often with bits of grain floating in it. Brewed from barley, it was filling and nutritious, a drink that provided energy for laborers in the fields and workers on great monuments. Beer was drunk by everyone, men, women, and even children. It was safer than water, which could sometimes carry disease, and it was a daily part of life, as common as the Nile itself. Vegetables formed another important part of the diet. Onions, garlic, and leeks were favorites, often eaten raw or cooked into stews. These foods were cheap, filling, and easy to grow in the fertile soil near the river. Lentils and chickpeas provided protein, while cucumbers and melons offered freshness in the hot climate. Dates and figs were common fruits, sweet and nourishing, enjoyed both by the poor and the rich. Honey, though less common, was a prize sweetener, sometimes offered to the gods. Fish from the Nile was another staple. Catfish, perch, and tilapia were caught in nets or with simple hooks. The fish could be eaten fresh, grilled over open flames, or preserved by drying and salting. Meat, however, was far less common for the ordinary Egyptian. Chickens and cows were valuable, kept more for their eggs and milk than for slaughter. For most people, meat was eaten only on special occasions, festivals, or as offerings from temple distributions. The wealthy, on the other hand, enjoyed more frequent servings of beef, goose, and duck. Dairy also had a place at the Egyptian table. Milk, cheese, and butter were produced, though they were less central to the diet than bread and beer. Goat's milk and cow's milk were both consumed, and soft cheeses flavored with herbs were sometimes enjoyed. A meal in an ordinary household was simple. In the morning, families might eat bread and drink beer. At midday, after hours of work in the fields, they might return for more bread, perhaps with onions or lentils, and some fish if it had been caught. The evening meal, shared together, could include bread, stews made with vegetables, dates for sweetness, and on good days a piece of meat or fowl. These meals were not feasts, but steady, sustaining fuel for life. For the wealthy, however, meals were occasions to display abundance. Paintings in tombs show banquets where guests sat before low tables piled high with bread, meat, vegetables, fruits, and jars of wine. Servants poured drinks, while musicians played harps and flutes. Women wore fine linen and perfumed wigs, and men reclined eating roasted duck or beef ribs, with cups of wine imported from distant lands. Wine, unlike beer, was a luxury. Made from grapes, it was produced in special vineyards and enjoyed by nobles and priests. Wine jars were often labeled with the year of harvest and the vineyard's location, a sign of its importance. Spiced and flavored wines also existed, reserved for the upper classes. Feasting also had a religious role. Festivals honoring gods were often marked by large communal meals. Temples sacrificed animals, and the meat was distributed among priests, workers, and sometimes the public. These occasions allowed ordinary Egyptians to taste foods that were rare in their everyday lives. Sharing food in festivals was a way of connecting with both the divine and the community. One must also imagine the smells and sounds of food preparation in ancient villages. The grinding of grain, the bubbling of stews in clay pots, the crackle of bread baking, the scent of onions and garlic frying, all of these filled the air. In richer homes, the aromas were more varied: roasted meat, spices, honey cakes, and wine. Food was not only about survival, it was also about pleasure and memory. Still, food was not always plentiful. The Egyptians depended on the Nile's flood to fertilize the fields. If the flood was too low, harvests failed. In such years, famine struck. People survived on whatever they could find: wild plants, fish, or even stored grain if it was available. Hunger was a constant shadow, reminding Egyptians that their lives rested on the river's generosity. Yet in their writings, Egyptians often spoke of food with joy. Love poems compare sweethearts to figs and honey. Prayers to the gods include requests for bread and beer in the afterlife. Tomb paintings show banquets not as luxuries, but as visions of eternity, where the deceased hoped to eat and drink forever. For them, food was not only nourishment, but also a symbol of abundance, life, and divine blessing. At the end of a long day, after fields were worked and animals tended, families gathered for their meal. The flickering light of oil lamps illuminated faces as bread was broken and bowls of stew were passed around. Children laughed, mothers reminded them to eat slowly, and fathers spoke of tomorrow's work. In that simple act of sharing food, the spirit of Egypt lived, steady, enduring, and bound to the rhythms of the Nile. So while kings built monuments to eternity and priests chanted in temples, the true foundation of Egypt was here, in the bread baked in mud brick ovens, in the beer brewed in clay jars, in the fish grilled by the river, and in the quiet meals of families who found comfort in the ordinary. Food, both humble and grand, was the heart of Egyptian life. Clothing and beauty in ancient Egypt. In the blazing heat of Egypt's desert sun, the way people dressed was more than a matter of fashion. It was a matter of survival. Linen garments, carefully woven from the fibers of the flax plant, were light, breathable, and perfectly suited to the climate. But clothing in ancient Egypt was more than just practical, it was also symbolic. The way men and women dressed reflected their social status, their occupation, and their connection to the divine. Alongside clothing came beauty practices, wigs, perfumes, and cosmetics, which revealed to us a culture that valued appearance, cleanliness, and self-presentation. To walk through the streets of an Egyptian village or the halls of a noble household was to see how clothing and beauty shaped daily life. The most common fabric was linen, produced from flax grown along the Nile. Flax stalks were harvested, soaked, beaten, and spun into fine threads. These threads were then woven on looms, producing cloth that could be coarse for common laborers or so fine that it was almost transparent, reserved for the wealthy. Linen was always white or off-white, since dyeing was rare and expensive. The whiteness of the fabric also symbolized purity and cleanliness, qualities highly valued in Egyptian culture. For ordinary men, clothing was simple. Most wore a short kilt, called a shendit, made of linen wrapped around the waist and tied with a belt. The length and quality of the kilt reflected one's status. A farmer's kilt was rough and short, while a nobleman's might be pleated and extend almost to the ankles. Laborers often worked nearly naked in the fields, wearing little more than a simple wrap, since the heat was unbearable. Women's clothing was equally simple, yet graceful. The most common garment was a straight, ankle-length dress, often with shoulder straps. For wealthier women, dresses could be pleated or decorated with beads, emphasizing elegance. The clothing of women was designed not only for comfort, but also to highlight the body's natural form. Ancient Egyptian art often shows women in tightly fitting dresses that reveal the ideal of beauty in their society: slim, youthful, and graceful. Children in their early years often wore no clothing at all. This was practical in the hot climate and also reflected their innocence. As they grew older, boys and girls wore miniature versions of adult clothing. Hairstyles also marked their youth. A common style was the side lock of youth, where children's heads were shaved except for one lock of hair on the side, a sign of childhood. Footwear was uncommon for most Egyptians. People generally went barefoot, especially in rural areas. Sandals made of papyrus or leather were worn by the wealthy or by those in official positions. Even pharaohs, as shown in art, are often barefoot in ceremonial scenes, though they owned ornate sandals for certain occasions. Clothing, however, was only one part of appearance. Beauty and personal care played an important role in Egyptian life, for both men and women. Cleanliness was seen as a virtue, and bathing in the Nile or using basins of water at home was a regular habit. Ointments made from oils and fats were applied to the skin to protect against the harsh desert sun and to prevent dryness. Perfumes made from myrrh, frankincense, and lotus were treasured luxuries. Wealthy Egyptians might burn incense in their homes, filling the air with sweet, calming scents. One of the most distinctive features of Egyptian beauty was the use of cosmetics. Men and women alike used makeup, not only for appearance, but also for protection. The famous black eyeliner, known as kohl, was applied around the eyes to reduce the sun's glare and to ward off eye infections. Made from ground minerals such as galena, kohl gave Egyptians their striking, almond-shaped eyes, a look still admired today. Green eye paint made from malachite was also common, associated with fertility and protection from the gods. Lips and cheeks were tinted with red ochre, while henna was used to stain nails and even hair. Cosmetics were not considered vain or frivolous. They were part of health, religion, and everyday life. To go without them would have been unusual, especially for adults. Hair also held great importance. Ordinary Egyptians often kept their heads shaved for cleanliness and to avoid lice. But wigs were widely worn, especially by the wealthy. Wigs could be simple or elaborate, made of human hair, sheep's wool, or plant fibers. Styles varied: short curls, long braids, or layered designs. For festivals and banquets, wigs were perfumed with cones of scented fat that slowly melted, releasing fragrance throughout the evening. Beards, too, carried meaning. While most men were clean-shaven, pharaohs sometimes wore false beards as symbols of divine power, even the female pharaoh Hatshepsut. Jewelry was another essential part of beauty and status. Even the poorest Egyptians wore amulets or simple beads, while the wealthy adorned themselves with gold, silver, and precious stones. Necklaces, bracelets, rings, and earrings were common, often decorated with symbols of protection, such as the ankh, symbol of life, or the scarab beetle, symbol of rebirth. Jewelry was not only decorative, but also spiritual, believed to guard the wearer from harm. The ideal of beauty in ancient Egypt was not only about appearance, but also about youthfulness and vitality. Paintings and statues often depict men as strong and muscular, women as slender and elegant, regardless of their actual age. This artistic choice reflected a cultural desire to portray eternal youth and health, qualities associated with the afterlife. During festivals and feasts, clothing and beauty reached their most elaborate forms. Nobles wore pleated garments of the finest linen, their bodies adorned with gold collars and jeweled headbands. Women painted their eyes dark, wore heavy earrings, and placed fresh flowers in their wigs. Servants poured fragrant oils over guests' heads, and the entire scene shimmered with color, music, and scent. These moments were not only celebrations of life, but also reminders of the Egyptians' deep connection to beauty, pleasure, and the divine. Yet for all the elegance of the wealthy, the simplicity of the common people was no less meaningful. A farmer in his short linen kilt, his skin darkened by the sun, or a woman in her plain white dress, grinding grain for her family, embodied the essence of Egyptian life. Their clothing was practical, their beauty natural, but they shared the same values of cleanliness, appearance, and dignity as their rulers. In the end, clothing and beauty in ancient Egypt were not mere details of fashion. They were expressions of identity, culture, and spirituality. Through their linen garments, their painted eyes, their scented wigs, and their shining jewelry, the Egyptians told the world who they were. They sought not only to look good, but also to live in harmony with the gods, the Nile, and the eternal cycles of life. And so, as the sun set over the desert and families prepared for evening meals, They did so dressed in the same garments and adorned with the same touches of beauty that had marked their ancestors for centuries. Simple or splendid, practical or divine, these choices of appearance were part of the rhythm of life. A rhythm that, like the Nile, flowed on and on through the ages. Work and occupations in ancient Egypt. Every civilization rests upon the shoulders of its workers, and in ancient Egypt this truth was clear. From the farmers who tilled the fertile fields of the Nile to the skilled artisans who carved stone into monuments, the Egyptians filled their days with labor that sustained not only their families but also their nation. Work was not just a duty, it was a rhythm of life, bound to the river, the seasons, and the needs of society. To walk through the villages and cities of Egypt was to see people engaged in 1,000 different tasks, each one essential to the great whole. For most Egyptians, work began in the fields. Farming was the backbone of the economy, and the Nile's annual flood dictated the agricultural calendar. When the waters receded, farmers planted wheat, barley, flax, and vegetables in the dark, fertile soil. With wooden plows pulled by oxen, men broke the ground, while women and children scattered seeds. During the growing season, irrigation channels carried water from the Nile to the fields, and farmers worked tirelessly to maintain them. At harvest time, sickles made of wood and flint were used to cut grain, which was then bundled, threshed, and stored in granaries. Farming was hard, physical work, but it fed the entire population. Beyond farming, fishing was another key occupation. Fishermen set out in reed boats, casting nets or hooks into the waters of the Nile. Their catch, catfish, perch, tilapia, was a major source of food. Some fish were eaten fresh, while others were dried and salted for later use. Fishing was a skill passed down from father to son, and it provided steady work for many families. Craftsmen formed another important part of society. In dusty workshops, carpenters shaped wood into furniture, chests, and boats. Potters molded clay into jars, bowls, and lamps, their wheels spinning slowly as hands shaped each vessel with care. Weavers worked at looms, producing linen for clothing, from coarse everyday fabric to fine cloth for the wealthy. Jewelry makers crafted delicate beads and amulets from gold, faience, and semi-precious stones, creating items both beautiful and symbolic. Each craft required years of practice, and skill was often passed through families, creating generations of artisans. Among the most admired occupations was that of the scribe. Literacy was rare, and those who could read and write held a special place in Egyptian society. Scribes recorded taxes, legal contracts, religious texts, and government decrees. They worked with reed pens and ink on papyrus scrolls, their precise handwriting preserving the words of kings and priests. To become a scribe required training in temple schools, and the position often led to wealth and influence. Parents dreamed of sending their sons to become scribes, for this path offered stability and prestige far beyond that of farming or manual labor. Another honored group was the priests, who oversaw the rituals and daily functions of the temples. Their work was spiritual rather than physical, but it was demanding nonetheless. Priests bathed several times a day, shaved their bodies for purity, and conducted ceremonies for the gods. They managed temple lands, collected offerings, and acted as intermediaries between the divine and the people. For the Egyptians, the priests' work ensured that the gods remained favorable, that the Nile would flood, and that order would prevail. Soldiers also played a vital role. While Egypt was often protected by its deserts and the river, conflicts with neighbors still occurred, and the army defended the nation. Soldiers trained with bows, spears, and shields. In times of peace, they also worked as laborers, building canals, roads, and monuments. Military service provided opportunities for social advancement. A successful soldier could gain land, wealth, or even rise to positions of authority. One of the most fascinating groups of workers were the tomb builders of Deir el-Medina. This village, near the Valley of the Kings, housed artisans, painters, and masons who created the elaborate tombs for pharaohs and nobles. These workers were highly skilled, carving walls, painting scenes of daily life and the afterlife, and designing treasures that would accompany the dead. Though their labor was tied to death, their artistry brought life and color to the stone chambers deep beneath the desert. Work was not limited to men. Women also contributed significantly to the economy. In addition to managing households, many women worked as weavers, bakers, brewers, and midwives. Some women even served as priestesses in temples or managed businesses. Records show that women could own land, sign contracts, and employ servants, giving them opportunities not common in many other ancient societies. Servants and slaves also existed in Egypt, though slavery was often different from what we imagine today. Many slaves were prisoners of war, while others sold themselves into servitude to escape poverty. They worked in households, fields, and workshops, supporting the lives of their masters. Though their lives were hard, they were still considered part of the household, and some could earn their freedom over time. Each day's work was shaped by the rising and setting of the sun. At dawn, farmers began their labor in the fields, artisans entered their workshops, and scribes unrolled their scrolls in cool chambers. The heat of midday slowed activity, but by evening, families gathered at home to rest. Work was not just about survival, it was about belonging. Each person's effort contributed to the great machine of Egyptian society, from the humblest fisherman to the pharaoh himself, who was seen as the ultimate worker, responsible for maintaining order and harmony across the land. Despite the hardships of labor, Egyptians also valued leisure and balance. Festivals gave workers time to rest, celebrate, and enjoy music, dancing, and feasts. Religious holidays allowed people to step away from their daily tasks and connect with their community and gods. In this balance between work and rest, Egyptians found meaning and stability. Looking back, we often marvel at the monuments of Egypt, the pyramids, the temples, the statues carved from stone. But behind these wonders stood countless workers whose names are mostly lost to history. Their sweat mixed with the Nile's soil, their hands shaped stone and wood, their pens captured the words of kings. They were farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, scribes, priests, soldiers, and servants. Together, they built not only the monuments of Egypt, but also its very heart. And so, when the evening sun dipped below the horizon and the land cooled, these workers laid down their tools. Families gathered, meals were shared, and stories were told. Tomorrow would bring another day of labor, another chance to sow, build, write, or carve. Through education and writing in ancient Egypt. In the hush of an early Egyptian morning, as the Nile mist drifted low and birds rose into the sunlit sky, children stirred from sleep in mud-brick homes across the land. For most, the day began with chores, fetching water, grinding grain, tending to goats or ducks. But for a select few, those born into families of privilege or ambition, the day began not with farm tools but with tablets, ink palettes, and the promise of education. In ancient Egypt, learning was not merely a path to knowledge. It was a gateway to power, status, and influence. The world of the scribes. To be a scribe was to hold one of the most respected and essential positions in Egyptian society. Farmers might till the land, soldiers might fight the wars, and artisans might craft the temples. But scribes gave the civilization its voice. They preserved laws, recorded harvests, composed prayers, and communicated the pharaoh's decrees. For this reason, families often dreamed of sending at least one son to train as a scribe. Such an opportunity promised an escape from the back-breaking cycles of farming and manual labor. In scribal schools, the work was demanding, but the rewards were immense. Literacy was rare, reserved for perhaps 1% of the population, and those who mastered it stepped into a world closed off to most Egyptians. The tools of learning. The classroom of an ancient Egyptian student looked very different from a modern school, yet in many ways it felt familiar. Lessons took place in temples, administrative offices, or small schools attached to larger estates. Students sat cross-legged on reed mats, clutching wooden boards covered with plaster. Upon these boards they practiced writing with a reed brush dipped in black or red ink. Black ink was used for everyday text, while red marked headings or important words, much like our use of bold or italic today. Papyrus scrolls, though costly, were also used. The making of papyrus itself was a marvel. The stalk of the papyrus plant was sliced, pressed, and dried into thin sheets that could be rolled into scrolls. These scrolls became the canvases of history, carrying hymns, contracts, medical texts, and timeless stories. The journey of learning. The path to literacy was long and repetitive. Students memorized signs and words by endlessly copying them. Hieroglyphs, the elegant pictorial script of Egypt, required years to master, with hundreds of signs representing objects, sounds, and ideas. Alongside hieroglyphs, students learned hieratic, a faster cursive form used for everyday writing. One can almost picture a boy's hand trembling as he tried to draw a falcon or a coiled rope, each mistake scolded by his teacher. The work was tedious, but discipline was strict. Egyptian proverbs remind us of this, such as one that warned, "A boy's ear is on his back. He listens when he is beaten." Learning was no easy task, and the rod of correction often fell on students who faltered. Yet the rewards were profound. In scribal texts that have survived, we hear echoes of pride. Be a scribe, it saves you from toil. You will not have to carry a basket or hoe. For families, this was enough motivation to endure the hardships of training. What was taught? While writing was the heart of Egyptian education, it was not the only subject. Arithmetic was essential for managing land, calculating taxes, and constructing temples. Students solved problems with fractions, measuring grain or dividing fields. They also learned geometry, vital for re-establishing field boundaries after the Nile's floods. Moral lessons and wisdom literature were equally important. Texts like the Instruction of Ptahhotep or the Instruction of Ani guided students on how to live virtuously, respecting elders, avoiding arrogance, and speaking truth. These works blended ethics with practical advice, offering a blueprint for life. Religion, too, permeated education. Many lessons included hymns or prayers, and students were reminded constantly of their duty to the gods. After all, writing itself was considered a sacred gift, attributed to Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and scribes. Every act of writing was, in a sense, an act of devotion, the life of a scribe. For those who succeeded, the scribal life was filled with opportunities. A scribe might work in a temple, recording offerings and rituals. Another might serve in government, tracking tax payments or managing construction projects. Some worked for the military, keeping rosters of soldiers and supplies. Scribes were also the keepers of memory. They wrote letters for the illiterate, recorded love poems, and even drafted magical spells to protect families or heal the sick. Their words gave shape to every corner of Egyptian life. The status that came with this profession cannot be overstated. While farmers toiled under the sun, a scribe worked in shade. While soldiers risked their lives, a scribe held steady ink and brush. It was said that a scribe's pen was mightier than any weapon, for with it he could alter destinies. Education for girls. While education was largely reserved for boys, there is evidence that some girls, especially daughters of priests or elite families, also received training. Women could become priestesses, singers in temples, or even administrators, and literacy enhanced their ability to serve. Though rare, the presence of literate women in Egyptian society underscores the complexity of gender roles in this ancient world. Storytelling as education. Outside formal schools, knowledge passed through oral tradition. Grandparents told children tales of the gods, heroes, and moral lessons. Farmers taught their sons how to plow, mothers taught their daughters how to manage households, and artisans passed down their crafts through apprenticeships. Thus, education was not limited to ink and papyrus. It was woven into the fabric of daily life, ensuring that skills, values, and traditions endured through generations. The legacy of writing. The power of Egyptian education and writing can still be felt today. Without scribes, we would know almost nothing of this civilization. Their texts, preserved on tomb walls and papyrus scrolls, reveal their laws, beliefs, and even their jokes. In a sense, every modern reader of Egyptian history is still a student of those ancient schools, tracing the brushstrokes of long-gone scribes. As the sun set on a typical school day, young students packed away their palettes and tablets. Their hands were stained with ink, their backs sore from long hours of repetition. Yet their hearts carried the weight of something larger, the knowledge that they were keepers of words, guardians of a power few could wield. In the stillness of the desert night, when stars stretched across the heavens, one could almost imagine Thoth himself watching, his ibis eyes glinting with approval. For in every copied sign, in every carefully drawn falcon or reed, the divine gift of writing was reborn, carried forward by the next generation of scribes. Religion in everyday life continued. The role of priests. Priests in ancient Egypt were not simply spiritual leaders, they were caretakers of the gods themselves. Egyptians believed that gods lived physically inside their statues, and it was the priest's duty to make sure the gods were comfortable, well-fed, and honored every single day. Each morning, priests entered the temple's holy sanctuary. They washed the statue of the god, dressed it in fine linen, and placed food and drink before it. This was not symbolic, it was a genuine act of service. The god's favor depended on being treated well. After the rituals, the food was not wasted. Priests and temple workers consumed it, believing it carried the god's blessing. Priests also performed rituals to maintain Ma'at, the cosmic order. For Egyptians, chaos was always a threat, and religious rituals were essential to keep balance in the world. Festivals, religion for the people. If daily rituals were quiet and hidden, festivals were the opposite, loud, colorful, and full of life. Festivals brought gods out of their temples and into the streets. One of the most famous was the Opet festival in Thebes, dedicated to Amun, Mut, and Khonsu. During this grand celebration, the statue of Amun was carried in a golden bark, sacred boat, along the Nile from Karnak to Luxor. Crowds gathered along the riverbanks to cheer, sing, dance, and offer prayers. Music filled the air, drums, sistrums, and flutes, while people feasted and shared in joy. Festivals were not only spiritual, they were also social. For many Egyptians, it was the only time they saw their gods face to face, even if only in statue form. These events gave them a sense of closeness to divine powers and to their community. Magic and amulets. Religion in Egypt was deeply tied to magic, or Heka, which Egyptians saw as a natural force that even the gods used. Magic was not seen as superstition, but as a practical way to protect and heal. Amulets were the most common magical objects. Scarab beetles symbolized rebirth, the Eye of Horus protected against harm, and Ankhs represented life. Children often wore protective amulets to guard them from illness, while adults carried charms to bring good luck or fertility. Spells were also used in daily life. These were not secretive acts of witches, but respected practices. A farmer might recite words of protection before irrigating his field, believing they would keep pests away. A doctor might use medical herbs alongside magical incantations, blending science and religion into one. The afterlife in everyday thought. Perhaps the most profound influence of religion was the Egyptian obsession with the afterlife. Death was not the end, it was the beginning of a new journey. Every Egyptian, from pharaoh to peasant, hoped to reach the field of reeds, a paradise where they could farm, feast, and live eternally. This belief shaped behavior in daily life. People tried to live in harmony with Ma'at, truth, balance, justice, because they knew their hearts would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at in the afterlife. A light heart, free of sin and dishonesty, would ensure entry into paradise. A heavy heart would be devoured by Ammit, the terrifying demon part lion, part crocodile, part hippopotamus. Thus, morality was not just social, it was cosmic. Doing good deeds, caring for family, and honoring the gods were all investments in eternal happiness. Conclusion. Religion in ancient Egypt was not a separate part of life. It was life itself. From the amulet a child wore, to the festival that brought joy to the whole city, to the whispered prayer before bed, the gods were everywhere. Every action, from farming to writing to raising children, was infused with devotion and magic. For the Egyptians, religion was not a burden, but a source of comfort and order in a world that could often be uncertain. It gave them hope for the present and for eternity beyond death. Medicine and healing practices in ancient Egypt, healing in the land of the Nile. In the eyes of the ancient Egyptians, health was never simply a matter of the body. It was the balance of body, spirit, and the divine order known as Ma'at. To them, illness was not random. It could come from natural causes like spoiled food or insect bites, but it could also be the result of angering a god, being attacked by evil spirits, or the influence of the restless dead. Healing, therefore, required more than herbs or surgery. It required restoring harmony with both nature and the gods. Egypt was blessed with the Nile River, and along its fertile banks grew a vast collection of plants. These became the foundation of Egyptian medicine. Priests, healers, and specialized doctors all drew from this natural pharmacy. Yet Egyptian medicine went beyond simple remedies. It was one of the most advanced systems in the ancient world, a unique blend of science, observation, and magic. The healers, priests, doctors, and magicians. The healers of Egypt fell into several categories, often overlapping. Priests of Sekhmet. Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess, was both feared and worshipped as the bringer of disease and the power to cure it. Her priests often acted as physicians, combining ritual prayers with medical treatments. ONW, doctors. These were trained professionals, sometimes attached to temples, palaces, or military units. They could be highly specialized, some focused on the stomach, others on the eyes, and others still on teeth. This makes Egypt one of the earliest societies to practice medical specialization. Magicians. Magic was not seen as separate from medicine. A healer might apply an herbal ointment while reciting a spell to drive away the spirit causing the illness. To an Egyptian, this was a logical and necessary combination, addressing both the physical and spiritual roots of disease. The Ebers Papyrus, a medical encyclopedia. Much of what we know about Egyptian medicine comes from surviving medical texts written on papyrus. Among the most famous is the Ebers Papyrus, dating to around 1550 BCE, but containing knowledge likely centuries older. This text, over 100 pages long, is essentially a medical encyclopedia. It contains more than 700 remedies for illnesses ranging from simple stomach pains to serious injuries. Some treatments were surprisingly effective. Honey was used to treat wounds because of its natural antibacterial properties. Garlic and onions were prescribed to boost strength and immunity. Willow bark was used to ease pain and inflammation, much like aspirin today. Moldy bread was sometimes applied to infections, an accidental form of antibiotic treatment. The papyrus also included magical spells to accompany the remedies. For example, a healer might say, "Drive out the demon that gnaws in the belly," while giving an herbal laxative. Surgery and practical medicine. While much of Egyptian medicine relied on herbs and spells, they were not strangers to surgery and practical care. Archaeological evidence shows that Egyptian doctors could set broken bones, stitch wounds, and even perform basic dental procedures. Mummies provide fascinating proof of medical practice. Some show healed fractures that were carefully set, suggesting patients survived serious injuries thanks to skilled care. Skulls reveal evidence of trepanning, cutting into the bone, though whether this was for medical or ritual reasons remains debated. Dentistry was another major concern. Egyptian bread, often full of sand and grit from grinding stones, wore down teeth quickly. Cavities, abscesses, and tooth loss were common. Dentists, or doctors of the tooth, attempted to treat these problems with ointments and sometimes inserted makeshift replacements. Despite their knowledge, Egyptian doctors had limits. They could treat injuries and common illnesses, but many diseases, like plague or cancer, were beyond their reach. Magic, amulets, and spells. For the Egyptians, the unseen world was just as real as the visible one. A fever might be caused by bad water, but it could also be the result of a curse. Therefore, Healing often required magical protection. Amulets. The Eye of Horus was worn for protection and healing. Scarabs symbolized rebirth and were believed to restore vitality. Mothers placed amulets on their children to guard against sickness. Spells. Words had power. A healer might chant phrases while preparing a potion, believing the magic would make the medicine more effective. Rituals. In some cases, rituals involved transferring the illness into an object, like a wax figure, which was then destroyed to kill the disease. Everyday remedies for common people. Not every Egyptian could afford a professional doctor. Much of medicine happened at home, passed down through families. A mother might treat her child's cough with honey and figs. A farmer might rub oil on aching muscles after a day in the fields. Simple first aid, bandages, herbs, rest was part of daily life. Cleanliness also played a role. Egyptians valued bathing and used natron, a natural salt, to keep themselves and their homes free of pests. While they did not understand germs as we do today, their habits of washing and using antiseptic herbs likely prevented many infections. The afterlife and medicine death was not seen as failure in Egyptian medicine. Even when a healer could not cure the living body, they still played a role in preparing the dead for eternal life. The process of mummification, while religious, was also medical in its precision. Removing organs, drying the body with natron, and wrapping it in linen required knowledge of anatomy. In this way, medicine bridged the worlds of life and death. Doctors healed the sick when they could, and when they could not, embalmers ensured the body was preserved for eternity. The legacy of Egyptian medicine. Egyptian medicine influenced later civilizations, especially Greece. Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen studied Egyptian practices and carried them into the Mediterranean world. Even the famous Greek concept of balancing bodily humors may have roots in Egyptian ideas of harmony and ma'at. Modern science has shown that many Egyptian remedies, like honey for wounds and willow bark for pain, were effective. Of course, others, like using crocodile dung as contraception, were less reliable. Still, their mixture of observation, experimentation, and spiritual belief represents one of humanity's earliest attempts to understand health in a systematic way. Conclusion. Medicine in ancient Egypt was not a sterile, separate science. It was a living blend of nature, magic, and faith. A sick person might receive herbs for their symptoms, a spell for their spirit, and an amulet for protection, all at once. This holistic approach reflects the education and writing in ancient Egypt. When we think about ancient Egypt, most people imagine pyramids, mummies, and golden treasures. Yet one of the greatest treasures Egypt left behind was not physical at all. It was their writing system and their approach to education. Writing allowed Egyptians to record history, keep accounts, preserve religious texts, and communicate across generations. Without it, we would know almost nothing about their civilization. This part explores how Egyptians learned, what schools were like, who got to learn, and how writing shaped their world. The birth of hieroglyphs. Egyptian writing, known as hieroglyphs, emerged around 3200 BCE. The word hieroglyph means sacred carving, and for good reason. Egyptians believed writing was a gift from Thoth, the god of wisdom. To them, words had magical power. To write a name was to give it life. Hieroglyphs were incredibly detailed. A single word could be drawn with pictures of birds, eyes, waves, and human figures. Unlike modern alphabets, hieroglyphs combined phonetic symbols, like letters, with logograms, whole words, and determinatives, symbols that gave meaning to a word. For example, the symbol of a papyrus scroll indicated something related to writing or learning. Over time, writing became more practical. Scribes developed quicker scripts like hieratic and later demotic, which allowed faster writing for everyday use, such as contracts or tax records. Who learned to write? Writing was not for everyone. In fact, only a small percentage of Egyptians could read and write. Most people, farmers, artisans, laborers, remained illiterate. But for those who did learn, the rewards were enormous. The most important learners were scribes. A scribe was more than just a writer. He was the memory of Egypt. Scribes recorded harvests, kept track of taxes, copied religious texts, and even wrote letters for people who could not write themselves. To become a scribe was to enter an elite profession. Scribes were respected, well-fed, and free from hard manual labor. One ancient text, known as the Satire of the Trades, encouraged young boys to study hard by describing how miserable all other jobs were. Farmers bent in the sun, soldiers risking their lives, craftsmen straining their muscles, while the scribe simply sat and wrote in comfort. Schools in ancient Egypt. Education for scribes began young, often around the age of 5. Boys, and occasionally girls, though very rare, would enter scribal schools, usually attached to temples or government offices. A typical school day was long and strict. Students practiced writing on shards of pottery or pieces of limestone before being trusted with expensive papyrus. They copied lists of words, proverbs, and passages from religious texts. Mistakes were not tolerated, and discipline could be harsh. Teachers were known to use sticks for punishment. But beyond writing, students learned mathematics, law, and religious rituals. Some even studied foreign languages to serve as diplomats or traders. The best students could rise to high positions in government, becoming tax officials, temple administrators, or royal secretaries. Tools of a scribe. The scribe's toolkit was simple but powerful. It included reeds cut into pens, ink made from soot, black or ochre, red, mixed with water, papyrus, made from the papyrus plant that grew along the Nile. Red ink was often used for headings, important names, or warnings, while black ink was for the main text. Papyrus scrolls could be long, sometimes stretching over many feet, carefully rolled and stored in wooden chests. The act of writing was slow and deliberate, but it was also seen as sacred. Many scribes considered themselves servants of the gods of knowledge, believing their work carried eternal importance. Writing beyond scribes. While scribes were the main keepers of knowledge, writing touched other areas of Egyptian life too. Temples were covered in inscriptions of hymns and rituals. Tomb walls told stories of the deceased's life, their hopes for the afterlife, and prayers to the gods. Even ordinary objects like amulets, pottery, and scarabs were inscribed with protective words. Letters also played a role in personal life. Archaeologists have found personal letters written on papyrus, where family members asked for food, advice, or blessings. These letters show that writing was not only about politics or religion, but also about human connection. Education for the elite and the few women. Most children in Egypt learned skills from their parents. Sons followed their fathers in farming or trades, while daughters learned household management. Formal schooling was rare, reserved for the elite. However, there were exceptions. Some noble women could read and write, especially those connected to temples. Women sometimes became priestesses, doctors, or administrators in temples, and for that they needed education. Still, literacy remained overwhelmingly male-dominated. The legacy of Egyptian writing. The importance Egyptians placed on writing is clear in their monuments. Hieroglyphs cover temple walls, obelisks, and tombs. Pharaohs believed that as long as their names were written, they would live forever. Erasing someone's name, on the other hand, was seen as the ultimate punishment, erasing their soul from existence. This obsession with writing ensured that Egypt's culture endured for millennia. Even today we read their prayers, admire their poems, and study their medical texts. Without scribes, so much of this would have vanished. Conclusion. Education and writing in ancient Egypt were more than skills. They were pathways to power, immortality, and divine connection. The scribe's reed pen built the civilization as surely as the farmer's plow or the builder's hammer. While most Egyptians never held a pen, those who did shaped history itself. For the Egyptians, writing was not just about recording facts. It was about preserving the soul, keeping order, and linking the human world with the divine. In their eyes, to write was to live forever. If there was one single element that defined ancient Egyptian civilization, it was the river Nile. Without the Nile, Egypt would have been nothing more than a barren desert. With it, Egypt became one of the most successful and enduring civilizations in history. The Nile was not just a source of water, it was the heart, soul, and lifeblood of daily life. Every aspect of Egyptian culture, food, economy, religion, transport, and even their calendar, was shaped by the river. The annual floods. The most important feature of the Nile was its annual flooding, known as the inundation. Each year, from July to September, the river swelled with waters from rains in Ethiopia. When the flood receded, it left behind rich black silt, making the land incredibly fertile. This predictable cycle gave Egyptians a sense of security unknown to many other ancient peoples. They knew the Nile would always return, always bring new soil, and always support new crops. This reliability shaped their optimistic worldview and belief in cosmic balance, Mayat. Farmers depended on the floods to plant wheat, barley, flax, and vegetables. Without the Nile, there would have been no agriculture, no bread, no beer, and no surplus to trade. The river was Egypt's natural miracle, irrigation and farming. The Nile's waters had to be managed carefully. Egyptians developed canals, dikes, and basins to guide water into their fields. Simple tools like the shaduf, a wooden pole with a bucket and counterweight, helped farmers lift water from the river into irrigation channels. This allowed them to grow crops, not only during the flood season, but throughout the year. Vegetables like onions, garlic, cucumbers, and lettuce were staples of the Egyptian diet, all made possible by the Nile's gift. Animals also benefited. Cattle, donkeys, goats, and geese all thrived because the Nile supported abundant grazing lands. Fishing was another important activity, providing both food and trade goods. Transportation and trade. The Nile was not just farmland. It was Egypt's highway. Boats sailed up and down its waters carrying goods, people, and ideas. Because the river flowed north while the wind blew south, it was possible to travel in both directions easily. Row with the current going north, raise sails against the wind going south. This dual movement made Egypt a hub of commerce. Grain, gold, papyrus, linen, and stone were transported along the river. Traders brought exotic goods such as incense, ivory, and spices from Nubia and beyond. The river connected not just villages, but entire regions of the ancient world. The Nile in religion. To Egyptians, the Nile was not just water, it was divine. They worshipped Hapi, the god of the inundation, often shown as a plump figure carrying plants and offering abundance. Festivals were held to honor him, thanking him for the life-giving floods. The Nile was also tied to myths. According to legend, the tears of the goddess Isis caused the river to flood when she wept for her husband Osiris. This story connected the river's cycles to cosmic order and renewal. Priests often performed rituals at the riverbanks, and water from the Nile was used in temple ceremonies for purification. Just as the river cleansed the land, it was believed to cleanse the soul. The calendar and daily life. The Egyptian year itself was based on the Nile's cycles. It was divided into 3 seasons. 1. Akhet, inundation, flooding season, July-September, when fields were underwater. 2. Pare, emergence, growing season, October-February, when crops were planted. 3. Shemu, harvest, harvest season, March-June, when crops were gathered. This calendar structured work, festivals, and religious ceremonies. Even laborers on royal projects were given breaks during flood season, as fields could not be farmed. For ordinary Egyptians, the rhythm of the Nile was the rhythm of life itself. The Nile as a source of identity. Egyptians saw themselves as the people of the Nile. Their homes, farms, and cities hugged the riverbanks, leaving the vast deserts largely empty. Travelers who ventured away from the Nile quickly realized how dependent life was on its waters. The green strip along the river contrasted sharply with the golden sands beyond, symbolizing life against death, fertility against barrenness. This duality, also influenced Egyptian spirituality. The Nile represented renewal and hope, while the desert represented chaos and danger. The balance between them mirrored Ma'at, order over disorder. The Nile and leisure beyond survival. The Nile also provided leisure. Egyptians enjoyed swimming, fishing with nets and boating. Children often played along the riverbanks, while nobles organized hunting trips for birds and hippopotamuses in the marshlands. Paintings from tombs show scenes of families joyfully sailing, casting nets, and enjoying the river's bounty. For them, the Nile was not only practical, but also pleasurable, a place of beauty and relaxation. Challenges of the Nile. Despite its blessings, the Nile could also bring challenges. If the floods were too low, crops failed and famine struck. If the floods were too high, they destroyed homes and fields. Egyptian rulers, especially the pharaohs, were often judged by how well they managed the Nile's blessings. This uncertainty kept Egyptians humble. While they trusted the river, they also prayed constantly to Hapi and the gods to ensure the floods were just right. Conclusion. The Nile was more than a river, it was Egypt itself. It shaped agriculture, economy, religion, society, and identity. To live in Egypt was to live by the Nile's rules, to celebrate its floods, to sail on its waters, and to hope for its blessings year after year. Without the Nile, there would have been no pyramids, no temples, no pharaohs, and no civilization. It was the true miracle of Egypt, the eternal gift that turned desert into paradise. Art, beauty, and personal adornment in ancient Egypt. When we think of ancient Egypt, images of towering pyramids and hieroglyph-covered temples usually come to mind. But just as important were the smaller, more personal expressions of creativity and beauty that colored everyday life. For Egyptians, art was not only a matter of grandeur and monuments, it was also woven into daily existence, from the beads around a child's neck to the kohl lining a farmer's wife's eyes. Personal adornment, cosmetics, and artistry were reflections of identity, spirituality, and even social status. The Egyptian sense of beauty. Egyptians had a refined appreciation for aesthetics. They saw beauty as both a personal virtue and a reflection of cosmic order, or Ma'at. Cleanliness and grooming were considered essential. It was said that a person who neglected their appearance disrupted harmony. Men and women alike bathed daily in the Nile or in household basins, often using natron, a natural salt, as soap. Hair care was also vital. While some wore their hair long and braided, many shaved their heads and wore wigs, especially in the hot climate. Wigs were not only practical, but also stylish, often decorated with beads, ribbons, or perfumed wax cones that melted slowly, releasing fragrance throughout the day. The power of jewelry. Jewelry was everywhere in Egypt, worn by rich and poor alike. Gold was the most prized material, not only for its beauty but also because it never tarnished, symbolizing eternal life. Skilled artisans crafted necklaces, bracelets, and rings in dazzling designs, often combining gold with semi-precious stones like carnelian, turquoise, lapis lazuli, and faience, a bright blue glazed ceramic. For the wealthy, jewelry displayed status. A nobleman might wear a broad collar necklace with rows of inlaid stones, glittering in the sunlight. For commoners, beads of clay or faience still carried protective and decorative value. Jewelry wasn't just for adornment, it was also amuletic. A scarab-shaped ring might grant protection, while a necklace with the Eye of Horus symbol guarded against evil. Even children were adorned. Mothers tied protective amulets around their babies' necks or wrists, believing these would ward off illness or misfortune. Cosmetics and perfume. Egyptians, men and women alike, were famous for their use of cosmetics. Eye makeup, particularly black kohl, is perhaps the most recognizable. Applied with small sticks or brushes, kohl was not just about beauty, it served practical and spiritual purposes. The dark lining around the eyes reduced glare from the desert sun and was believed to ward off infections. At the same time, heavily outlined eyes symbolized protection by the gods Horus and Ra. Green eye paint, made from malachite, was also popular. It was associated with rebirth and health, linking wearers to the regenerative powers of the Nile and the god Osiris. Perfume, too, was an essential part of daily life. Egyptians created scented oils and balms from flowers, herbs and resins such as myrrh and frankincense. The wealthy stored them in beautifully carved alabaster jars. On hot days, people wore perfumed wax cones on their heads that slowly melted, releasing fragrance and masking sweat. Clothing and fabric. Egyptian clothing was generally simple but elegant. Linen, made from flax, was the most common fabric. Its lightness was perfect for the hot climate. Men wore short kilts called shendit, while women wore straight, form-fitting dresses with straps. Wealthy Egyptians added pleats, embroidery, or sheer layers to their garments, turning simplicity into sophistication. Clothing was also a marker of status. A peasant might wear a plain, undecorated kilt, while a noble might wear robes with fine pleating and jewelry. Priests dressed in pure white linen, symbolizing ritual cleanliness. Footwear was rare for the poor, who often went barefoot. The wealthy wore sandals made of papyrus or leah. Hairstyles and wigs were one of the most iconic fashion items in Egypt. They ranged from simple short styles to elaborate shoulder-length pieces. Wealthier individuals might own multiple wigs, swapping them out for different occasions, much as people today might change hairstyles. Children often had shaved heads with a single side lock of youth, a braid or lock of hair that identified them as young. As they grew older, their hair was allowed to grow freely. Art in the household. Everyday Egyptians were surrounded by art. Pottery was often decorated with painted designs, sometimes simple geometric patterns, sometimes lively scenes of plants and animals. Wooden furniture might be carved with animal legs or inlaid with ivory. Even tools such as cosmetic spoons or combs were crafted with elegance. A comb might be shaped like a lotus flower or carved with figures of animals. The beauty of the home reflected the Egyptian love for harmony. Walls of wealthier houses were painted with colorful murals, showing lotus ponds, gardens, or scenes of feasting. Even modest homes included simple decorations to brighten the living space. Festivals and beauty. Religious festivals provided an opportunity for Egyptians to dress at their finest. People adorned themselves with their best clothing, jewelry, and perfumes. Women decorated their hair with flowers, and musicians often wore bright garlands as they played for dancing crowds. Festivals were not only moments of devotion, but also of joy, where art, beauty, and music blended into a living celebration. Beauty beyond death. The importance of beauty did not end with life. Egyptians took cosmetics, jewelry, and wigs into their tombs. A noblewoman might be buried with her favorite coal container or a jar of scented oil, believing she would need them in the afterlife. Amulets and jewelry placed with the body continued to serve their protective role in eternity. Even in death, Egyptians wished to appear in their finest form, for they believed the gods themselves admired beauty and purity. Conclusion. In ancient Egypt, art and personal adornment were not luxuries. They were necessities that gave structure and meaning to life. To paint one's eyes, to wear a necklace, to braid one's hair was not merely to look attractive, but to connect with the divine, to protect the self, and to uphold harmony. Beauty was everywhere. In the glitter of jewelry, the scent of perfume, the graceful pleats of linen, and the murals painted on house walls. Through these expressions, Egyptians showed that art was not only about grand temples and statues, but also about the daily rhythm of living beautifully. Festivals and entertainment life in ancient Egypt was not all about work in the fields or rituals in the temples. The Egyptians also knew how to celebrate. Their calendar was filled with festivals, religious and seasonal, that brought entire communities together. These festivals were not just moments of joy, but also essential expressions of faith and social unity. Alongside festivals, entertainment such as music, dance, board games, and storytelling enriched the daily life of both nobles and commoners. Festivals as religious expressions. Almost every festival in ancient Egypt was tied to religion. Gods were honored with parades, offerings, and public celebrations. Temples often served as the centers of activity, but the celebrations spilled out into the streets, where ordinary people could join in. One of the most important festivals was the Opet festival in Thebes, which honored the god Amun, his consort Mut, and their son Khonsu. During this event, statues of the gods were carried in boats along the Nile from Karnak to Luxor Temple. Music filled the air, priests performed rituals, and the people sang, danced, and feasted. It was a time when the gods were believed to come closer to the people, renewing their blessings on the land. Another popular festival was the beautiful Festival of the Valley, also in Thebes. Families visited the west bank of the Nile, where the necropolises and mortuary temples stood, bringing food and flowers to honor deceased relatives. This was a moment of reunion between the living and the dead, blurring the line between worlds in a joyous communal gathering. Festivals often coincided with agricultural cycles. When the Nile flood receded and fertile fields re-emerged, festivals marked gratitude and hope for a good harvest. These celebrations offered relief after months of hard labor and tied human survival to divine favor. Food, drink, and feasting. No Egyptian festival was complete without food and drink. Bread, beer, figs, dates, and roasted meat were shared in abundance. Wealthier households could afford delicacies such as honey, wine, and imported goods. The preparation of food during festivals was a communal act. Families and neighbors gathered to bake, brew, and roast together, strengthening social bonds. Beer, a staple of Egyptian life, flowed freely during these occasions, and it was common for people to drink far more than they would on ordinary days. For ordinary Egyptians, festivals were one of the few times they could indulge in food, usually reserved for the wealthy. Eating well on a festival day was seen as a way of honoring the gods, as well as enjoying the blessings of the land. Music and dance entertainment was at the heart of Egyptian celebrations. Musicians played harps, lutes, flutes, and drums, while dancers performed to the rhythm. Women were often professional dancers and musicians, trained to entertain at festivals, banquets, and temple events. Dance in Egypt was not only an art form but also a religious act. Ritual dances were performed to honor gods and goddesses, imitating the cycles of nature or mythological events. For example, dancers might move in ways symbolizing the rebirth of Osiris or the power of Hathor, the goddess of music, love, and joy. For the ordinary spectator, dance and music brought laughter and joy. The beats of drums and the strumming of strings created an atmosphere where worries were forgotten, if only for a while. Games and storytelling beyond religious festivals. Egyptians loved games and storytelling as forms of entertainment. One of the most popular board games was Senet, played on a grid of squares with pieces moved according to throws of sticks or knucklebones. The game was more than amusement. It carried spiritual meaning, symbolizing the soul's journey through the afterlife. Another game, Mayhen, was shaped like a coiled snake, with players moving lion-shaped pieces around the spiral board. These games entertained adults and children alike, and were found in both wealthy tombs and humble homes. Storytelling also played a central role in entertainment. Tales of gods, kings, and magical adventures were told orally and later written down on papyrus. Stories such as The Tale of the Shipwrecked Sailor or The Story of Sinuhe transported listeners to far-off lands, taught lessons, and provided moral reflections. Banquets and social gatherings. In noble households, entertainment often took the form of banquets. Guests were welcomed with perfumed oils, elegant clothing, and garlands of flowers. Musicians and dancers entertained, while servants carried trays of food and drink. At these gatherings, conversation, poetry, and riddles were exchanged. Such events were a way to display wealth and culture, but also to reinforce friendships and alliances. For common people, social gatherings were simpler, but no less joyous. Families gathered in courtyards, sang songs, clapped hands, and told stories while sharing modest meals. The essence of entertainment in Egypt was less about extravagance and more about togetherness. the balance of joy and duty. While Egyptians worked hard and lived within a structured society, entertainment and festivals balanced their lives. They believed joy was not separate from piety, but a way to honor the gods. Dancing, singing, feasting, and laughing were all considered part of divine order, the harmony of life that the Egyptians called ma'at. For them, to live a good life meant not only to work and worship, but also to celebrate, to laugh, and to cherish the company of others. Entertainment was not seen as frivolous, but as necessary for a complete, balanced existence. The role of children in ancient Egypt. When we think of ancient civilizations, we often imagine kings, priests, and workers. But what about the children who filled the homes, played in the streets, and carried the traditions forward? In ancient Egypt, children were not just passive observers. They were active members of society, learning skills, joining in family rituals, and preparing to take on adult responsibilities from a very early age. Childhood in the Nile Valley was both joyful and demanding, shaped by family expectations, religion, and the ever-present need to contribute to survival. A world full of children. Ancient Egypt was a society where families were large. With high child mortality rates, parents often had many children, both to ensure survival and because children were seen as blessings. For a farmer's family, more children meant more hands in the fields. For craftsmen, more children meant apprentices to carry on the family trade. And for women, motherhood was the ultimate mark of success. Children were celebrated at birth with protective rituals. Amulets in the shape of taweret or bez were placed near cradles, and families prayed for the child's health. Because medicine was limited, everyday dangers, from fever to infection, were a constant threat. Surviving early childhood was already an achievement. Clothing and appearance. Young children rarely wore much clothing. Boys often went naked until they were about 6 years old, while girls might wear simple linen dresses. Wealthier families sometimes dressed their children in finer linen, decorated with beads or embroidery. One of the most recognizable features of Egyptian childhood was the side lock of youth, a braid or lock of hair left on one side of the head, while the rest was shaved. This hairstyle marked the wearer as a child, and it was often depicted in art. It symbolized innocence and connection to the protective god Horus. Jewelry was common, not for fashion alone, but for protection. Children wore necklaces with amulets shaped like scarabs, ankhs, or eyes of Horus, believed to guard against illness and evil spirits. Education and learning education was not universal, but children learned constantly. For most, education happened at home or in the fields. Boys learned to farm, fish, or craft alongside their fathers. Girls learned to grind grain, weave linen, and manage household tasks from their mothers. This hands-on learning prepared them to contribute to family survival as soon as they were able. For the wealthy and for some temple families, formal schooling existed. Boys from elite families could attend schools run by scribes or priests, where they learned to read and write hieroglyphs and hieratic script. This education was demanding. Students copied texts for hours, learning not only language but also mathematics, law, and religious writings. Scribes held great prestige, and their education was the key to government positions. Girls rarely attended these schools, though there are a few examples of women who became scribes or doctors. More often, girls from wealthy families learned music, dance, or domestic management, preparing for roles as wives and mothers. Play and entertainment. Even with their responsibilities, Egyptian children had time for play. Toys have been found in tombs and ruins, carved wooden animals, dolls with movable limbs, spinning tops, balls made of leather or papyrus, and even board games like Senet. Children also played in groups outdoors. Wrestling, swimming in the Nile, and racing were common games. Music and dance were popular, and children often played with simple instruments like rattles and flutes. These games weren't just fun. They built strength, coordination, and social bonds that would serve them in adult life. Work and responsibility. Childhood in ancient Egypt was shorter than we might expect today. By the age of 6 or 7, children were already working, A boy might herd goats or carry water, while a girl might help grind flour or weave baskets. Older children often worked full days, nearly indistinguishable from adults. In craftsman families, children became apprentices. A son of a carpenter learned woodworking from an early age, while a daughter of a baker might learn to knead dough and sell bread at market. Skills were passed down through generations, ensuring that trades survived. In wealthy households, children did not need to labor, but they were expected to study, behave with dignity, and learn how to manage estates or serve in temples. Religion and children religion touched childhood deeply. Children were believed to be especially vulnerable to evil spirits, so families surrounded them with protective rituals. Amulets, spells, and prayers to gods like Bez and Taweret were constant. Festivals were especially exciting for children. During processions, children could watch giant statues of gods carried through the streets, eat special festival foods, and join in dances. For them, religion was not only about protection, but also about joy and belonging. Some children were dedicated to temples at a young age. They might serve as dancers, singers, or assistants in rituals. For a child from a humble family, this could provide safety, education, and even the possibility of rising to prominence. Transition to adulthood. Adulthood came early in ancient Egypt. By the early teenage years, many boys were already working full-time, and girls were often married by the age of 12 or 13. Marriage marked the end of childhood, as young women became wives and mothers, and young men became full contributors to the household. However, even in adulthood, the bonds of childhood remained. Families were central to Egyptian life, and loyalty to one's parents was considered a virtue. Ancient wisdom texts often urged children to honor their mothers and fathers, linking family devotion to divine order. The joys and hardships of childhood. For Egyptian children, life was a blend of joy and struggle. They experienced the warmth of family, the fun of games, and the wonder of festivals. But they also faced dangers from disease, accidents, and hard labor. Childhood was precious because it was fragile, and families went to great lengths to protect and cherish it. Through art, toys, and writings, we can still glimpse their laughter and their fears. In their small footprints left on mud bricks, in the worn handles of wooden dolls, and in the inscriptions carved by young scribes practicing their letters, the children of ancient Egypt remind us that even thousands of years ago, the experiences of youth were not so different from today. Leisure, games, and entertainment. When people think of ancient Egypt, they often imagine pharaohs seated on golden thrones, or workers toiling under the blazing sun to build pyramids. Yet beyond the grand monuments and daily labors, Egyptians, rich and poor alike, had a deep appreciation for leisure, play, and enjoyment. Just like us, they sought fun, relaxation, and a chance to escape from the demands of work. Entertainment was woven into their culture, not as a luxury, but as an essential part of life. Music in everyday life. Music was everywhere in ancient Egypt. It was not limited to the courts of pharaohs or great temples. It was part of ordinary households, celebrations, and festivals. Archaeological evidence shows a wide range of instruments: harps, lutes, flutes, tambourines, and sistrums, rattles with a jingling sound. Women often played music at banquets, dancing while plucking harps or beating hand drums. Professional musicians could be highly respected, especially those employed in temples to perform for the gods. Music carried religious meaning as well as social joy. Hymns to the gods were sung with devotion, while love songs, humorous tunes, and drinking songs filled the homes of everyday Egyptians. Interestingly, some scholars believe that Egyptian music had rhythms and melodies not unlike those of the Middle East today. Music, in many ways, was the background of life, there in moments of love, ritual, work, and rest. Games for children. Children in ancient Egypt enjoyed simple but creative games. They played with carved wooden animals, clay balls, and rag dolls stuffed with papyrus. Some toys had moving parts, showing the inventiveness of Egyptian artisans. Little boys and girls also played outdoor games that would seem familiar today. They ran races, played tug-of-war, wrestled, or threw balls made of papyrus fiber. The desert sands and Nile's banks became their playgrounds. Archaeologists have even found marbles, spinning tops, and small board games that children used. Childhood in Egypt was short. Many children began working at a young age, but play was always part of their early years. Senet, the game of fate. Perhaps the most famous Egyptian game was Senet, a board game played by both the wealthy and the poor. The game consisted of a grid of 30 squares arranged in 3 rows. Players used sticks or dice-like objects to move their pieces across the board. But Senet was more than just a pastime. Egyptians believed the game symbolized the journey of the soul through the afterlife. The moves represented challenges, dangers, and the god's will. Winning meant achieving safe passage into eternity. Paintings show pharaohs and queens playing Senet, suggesting it was a beloved form of entertainment. Even Tutankhamun's tomb contained Senet boards, showing how important it was for both life and death. Dance and celebration dancing was another central part of entertainment. In large festivals, professional dancers performed for crowds, sometimes wearing elaborate costumes and jewelry. Acrobatics, balancing acts, and rhythmic movement to drums and harps delighted audiences. But dancing wasn't only for professionals. Ordinary Egyptians danced at weddings, feasts, and religious events. Dance was seen as a way of honoring the gods and expressing joy. Banquets and feasts. For the wealthy, leisure often meant banquets. These gatherings were lively affairs, filled with music, dancing, fine food, and wine. Guests sat on low chairs while servants offered roasted meats, bread, fruits, and plenty of beer or wine. Lotus flowers, symbols of rebirth and beauty, were often given to guests to wear in their hair. Perfumed oils were applied to the body to keep cool and fragrant. The atmosphere was light-hearted, with jokes, songs, and laughter filling the air. Banquets could last late into the night, and they were not only about eating. They were displays of wealth, culture, and sophistication. Hunting, fishing, and sports. For men, especially the upper classes, hunting and fishing were popular forms of leisure. Noblemen often went on hunting expeditions in marshes, catching birds with throw sticks or spearing fish from boats. Hunting larger animals such as antelopes or lions was a display of courage and skill. Wrestling and archery were also common. Paintings show young men grappling in matches, using techniques that resemble modern wrestling moves. Archery contests tested precision and strength, while boat races across the Nile provided thrilling competition. Even the pharaohs participated in sport. A king's skill with a bow, his speed in a chariot, or his bravery in the hunt were seen as signs of divine favor. Storytelling and poetry entertainment wasn't only physical, it was also intellectual. Egyptians loved stories, myths, and poetry. Skilled storytellers recited tales of gods, heroes, and adventures, often mixing humor with wisdom. Love poems were especially popular. Written on papyrus or painted on walls, they captured the beauty of romance in simple, tender words. A lover might describe his beloved as the lotus blossom that makes my heart rejoice, or say her voice was sweeter than honey. Storytelling was also a way of passing on history and cultural values. Children grew up listening to tales of Osiris, Isis, Horus, and Set, which shaped their understanding of the world. Drinking and relaxation. Beer was the everyday drink of Egyptians, enjoyed by both rich and poor. But during festivals and celebrations, drinking became a form of entertainment in itself. Some texts describe parties where guests were encouraged to drink until they were merry. Wine, rarer and more expensive, was enjoyed by the wealthy. It was often flavored with honey, herbs, or fruit. Drinking was associated with Hathor, the goddess of love and joy, who was also called the mistress of drunkenness. Festivals. Entertainment for all festivals were perhaps the greatest form of leisure in ancient Egypt, open to both commoners and nobles. They honored gods and marked important events, but they were also joyful community celebrations. During festivals, Processions of priests carried statues of gods through the streets. Crowds sang, danced, feasted, and drank. Boats decorated with flowers floated on the Nile, while music and laughter echoed through towns and villages. These festivals broke the routine of daily life and allowed people to enjoy themselves freely, united by faith and joy. Conclusion. Daily life in ancient Egypt was not only about work, survival, or devotion to gods, it also had space for fun, laughter, and play. From children tossing clay balls to nobles playing sonnet, from the rhythms of music to the stories told by firelight, entertainment shaped the spirit of the people. It reminds us that across thousands of years, human beings remain the same at heart. We work, we worship, but we also play. And in those moments of play, the Egyptians found joy, meaning, and connection, just as we do today. The enduring legacy of ancient Egyptian daily life. When we think of ancient Egypt today, the first images that often come to mind are the monumental pyramids, the golden treasures of pharaohs, and the mysterious hieroglyphs carved into temple walls. Yet behind these wonders were real people, farmers, scribes, merchants, mothers, soldiers, and children, who lived ordinary lives thousands of years ago. Their daily struggles, joys, and routines shaped a civilization so resilient that its legacy still echoes in our world today. The bridge between ordinary and eternal. For the Egyptians, life was not divided into two separate spheres, worldly and spiritual. Instead, the daily and the eternal were woven together. To plant a seed in the soil was not just an act of farming, it was a sacred act tied to the cycle of creation. To grind grain into bread was not merely labor, it was honoring the gods who provided sustenance. To love, marry, and raise children was not simply family life, it was participating in the divine order, ensuring that Maat, the balance of the universe, remained strong. This mindset transformed everyday existence into a form of worship. Where modern societies often separate religion, work, and leisure, the Egyptians lived as though each breath carried divine significance. Their sense of continuity, the belief that life, death, and rebirth were all stages of one eternal journey, gave them resilience in times of famine, invasion, or hardship. Knowledge that outlived empires. The daily life of ancient Egypt also left behind practical knowledge that shaped the ancient world and beyond. Egyptian doctors trained in temples understood anatomy through mummification and practiced surgery with surprising precision. Their medical texts included hundreds of remedies, some effective, some magical, but many based on real observation. Their agricultural methods, rooted in the rhythm of the Nile, inspired irrigation systems that influenced later Mediterranean and Middle Eastern civilizations. Their writing system, hieroglyphs, not only recorded prayers and royal decrees, but also preserved mathematical formulas, astronomical calculations, and engineering notes. Without these records, we might never have learned how they aligned the pyramids with the stars or planned massive building projects. Even their leisure, music, board games like sonnet and festivals left marks on cultural traditions that resonate even today. The people behind the pyramids. For centuries, outsiders imagined that the pyramids and temples were built by slaves. Modern archaeology, however, paints a different picture. The laborers were not enslaved foreigners, but Egyptian farmers who worked for the state during the Nile's flood season, when their fields were underwater. They were housed, fed, and organized into teams, and many took pride in their work. Graffiti carved into the stones, messages like "the Friends of Khufu" or "the Drunkards of Menkaura" show us workers with humor, identity, and spirit. This discovery changes how we see their society. The monuments were not just the visions of kings, but the collective achievements of an entire people. Each massive block of stone is also a story of teamwork, organization, and national pride, the timeless appeal of their lives. What makes the study of ancient Egyptian daily life so captivating is its paradox. It feels both deeply foreign and strangely familiar. The Egyptians lived in mud brick houses with reed mats, yet they cherished family meals, celebrated holidays, worried about health, sought love. and dreamed of better futures. They feared disease, prayed for protection, and wished for prosperity, concerns that have never vanished from the human experience. We see ourselves in their laughter, their games, their songs, and their art. A painted scene of children splashing in the Nile could be mistaken for a modern summer day by the river. A carved depiction of a husband and wife holding hands reveals affection that feels timeless. Even their letters, complaints about missing deliveries, love notes, prayers for good health, read like echoes of modern conversations. Death as part of life. The Egyptians' obsession with death was, in truth, an obsession with life. Their elaborate tombs, rituals, and mummification were not morbid fascinations, but acts of hope. To prepare for death was to affirm belief in continuity, to ensure that one's story did not end in the grave. Ordinary Egyptians could not afford golden sarcophagi, but even the poorest placed small tokens, amulets, clay figurines, or favorite possessions beside their bodies, ensuring that they carried a piece of their life into eternity. The afterlife was not an abstract idea. It was seen as a perfected continuation of daily existence. Fields that always yielded harvest, families reunited, no pain or hunger, no oppression or loss. This belief gave them courage to endure the hardships of earthly life. The lessons for today. Why does the daily life of ancient Egypt matter to us now? Because it shows that civilization is not only measured in kings and wars, but also in kitchens, workshops, and markets. It is built not just in stone, but in habits, traditions, and values. The greatness of Egypt rested not only on pharaohs, but on farmers who tilled the soil, bakers who fed the community, scribes who preserved knowledge, and families who taught their children about Mahat, the balance between chaos and harmony. In a modern world often rushing forward, the Egyptians remind us of the power of rhythm, continuity, and respect for both nature and spirit. They teach us that even the smallest daily actions carry meaning when tied to a larger sense of purpose. Conclusion: a civilization of people, not just monuments. As our journey through 15 parts comes to an end, we are left with a picture of ancient Egypt, not as a land of distant wonders, but as a vibrant society full of living, breathing people. They built cities and temples, but also baked bread, sang songs, tended children, and shared stories by lamplight. The pyramids may stand as stone giants on the horizon, but the true strength of Egypt was always its people, their daily lives, their resilience, their faith, and their joy in living. When we say what daily life was really like in ancient Egypt, we are not just describing routines. We are uncovering the heartbeat of a civilization, one that continues to inspire awe more than 4,000 years later. When we look back at ancient Egypt, the towering pyramids, the golden treasures of pharaohs, and the mysterious hieroglyphs etched into temple walls often steal the spotlight. But behind these wonders stood millions of ordinary men and women, each living their lives with routines, struggles, joys, and dreams. To understand their daily existence is to understand the foundation of one of history's most remarkable civilizations. The rhythm of life along the Nile. The Nile River was more than just water. It was the heartbeat of Egypt. The river's flooding cycle dictated when seeds were planted, when fields were plowed, and when harvests were celebrated. A farmer's calendar was not measured in months alone, but in the rising and falling of the river. Daily life was physically demanding, but it was also rewarding. In the cool mornings, men and women worked the fields, children played on the riverbanks, and fishermen cast their nets. Afternoons brought rest from the blazing sun, while evenings were filled with family meals, storytelling, and small rituals of gratitude to the gods. In this way, the rhythm of life was steady, shaped by forces larger than any individual. It gave the Egyptians a sense of order, what they called mayat, the principle of balance and harmony. Home and family as the core of society. The family unit was the center of Egyptian society. Homes ranged from simple mud brick huts for farmers to spacious villas with painted walls for the wealthy. Regardless of status, family was sacred. Fathers worked to provide food and income, mothers managed the household, and children were cherished. Boys often learned trades from their fathers, farming, fishing, or crafts, while girls learned domestic skills from their mothers. But education was not limited to the elite. Even ordinary families tried to ensure their children could read and write at a basic level, if possible. Marriage was considered a partnership built on mutual respect, and women had more rights in Egypt than in many other ancient cultures. They could own property, initiate divorce, and manage businesses. This balance in family life reinforced the importance of harmony across all of society. Work and social roles. The daily labor of Egyptians was divided by profession, but every job had dignity. Farmers, scribes, builders, artisans, priests, and traders all played their roles. Work was not just for survival, it was also tied to service for the gods and for the eternal kingdom. Builders who raised monuments were not slaves, but skilled laborers who were compensated in food, beer, and clothing. Craftsmen who shaped statues or painted tombs saw their work as sacred, giving beauty to the gods and ensuring the immortality of the deceased. Even the humblest fisherman saw himself as part of the larger order of life sustained by the Nile. Festivals and joy. Despite the harsh realities of labor and disease, Egyptians knew how to celebrate. Religious festivals filled the calendar with music, dance, feasting, and boat processions. People drank beer, ate roasted meat, and danced in the streets. Children laughed, women wore flowers in their hair, and men played flutes and drums. These celebrations reinforced community bonds. In times of joy, the Egyptians reminded themselves that life was a blessing, and even in hardship, joy could be found. The ever-present afterlife. For Egyptians, life was never seen as an ending in itself. Every action in daily life was connected to preparation for eternity. Death was not feared. It was simply another stage of existence. The practice of mummification, the building of tombs, and the inclusion of everyday objects in burials all reflected the belief that the afterlife was a continuation of earthly life. Farmers were buried with plows, craftsmen with their tools, and wealthy nobles with games, jewelry, and food. This outlook gave Egyptians resilience. A poor harvest or a personal tragedy was endured with the belief that balance would return and that life, both now and after death, had purpose. Legacy of ordinary people. While kings and queens left behind massive monuments, it is the voices of ordinary people, preserved in letters, contracts, and graffiti, that tell us what life truly felt like. From love poems written on scraps of papyrus to simple carvings of workers in tomb art, we see that they laughed, loved, worried, and hoped just as we do today. They struggled with taxes, prayed for healthy children, argued with neighbors, and dreamed of a better future. And in these small details, their humanity comes alive across thousands of years. What we can learn today. Modern life often feels disconnected from the natural cycles that guided ancient Egypt. Yet their focus on balance, family, community, and respect for the environment offers lessons that remain timeless. The Egyptians remind us that true greatness is not only in towering monuments, but also in the small acts of daily living. Planting seeds, sharing meals, protecting children, and honoring the unseen mysteries of existence. Conclusion. The eternal Egypt. The pyramids may crumble, the paint on tomb walls may fade, and the treasures of kings may rest in museums, but the spirit of daily Egyptian life is eternal. In the laughter of a child playing on the riverbank, in the dedication of a craftsman shaping stone, in the love of a mother protecting her child, we find the real Egypt. Ancient Egyptian civilization was not only a story of pharaohs and temples, it was the story of people. People who woke each morning to the rising sun of Ra, who gave thanks to the river that sustained them, and who built a legacy so strong that it continues to fascinate and inspire us thousands of years later. In every brick of a humble mud house, in every hieroglyph scratched by a scribe, in every prayer whispered by a farmer, we see the true heartbeat of Egypt. And that heartbeat still echoes across time, reminding us that history is not just about kings, but about all of us.